And then from there, we actually just were able to scale the output without scaling the team size. So what that basically meant is that we were able to like triple the content production workflow, triple the ideation workflow, automate the technical documentation. Creativity and curiosity are going to be the competitive advantage that will drive the post-AI era, right? In a world where computers and AIs can have triple the IQ that most humans do, in a world where we're headed towards super intelligence and, dare I say, one day AGI.
Welcome back to Horizons Podcast, where I sit down with marketing leaders from across the industry. I'm your host, Nate Desmond, and today I'm excited to be sitting down with Pete Sena. Pete is a serial entrepreneur and creative strategist behind companies like Digital Surgeons, a consultancy he started way back in 2004, The Resonance, where he partners with the leading experts to create new revenue streams, and also District, which is a tech innovation campus in New Haven, Connecticut. He's known today for being an AI expert who helps people to build, grow, and scale companies using AI creativity, branding, and storytelling. Pete, welcome to the show.
It's good to be here. Thanks for having me, Nate.
I'd love to start at the beginning. So way back in 2004, you decided to start Digital Surgeons while still in college, in the middle of a recession. What led you to this nonlinear career path?
Yeah. So some people say like we choose companies, and then some people say companies choose us. And I'll give you the no BS answer. You know, I was a young guy in school. I was working for ESPN, a large sports marketing company here in Connecticut, and I was faced with a choice. And the choice was I could either go be an engineer or I could be a creative. And I was doing both at the time because, you know, when you're a young guy, you kind of get your hands on whatever you can, or a young person in the field. And that sort of inspired and sparked me. And I didn't like wake up one day and say, I want to be an entrepreneur. But as a young kid, I remember when I was, you know, I wake up one morning, I'm probably 14 years old, I'm watching TV like most kids do on the weekends. And I remember watching like one of those movie magic shows, you know, where it was the behind the scenes, and it was going into like the Terminator movie, Terminator 2, and, you know, specifically like Industrial Light and Magic and all the things that went behind it, the special effects. And I said, you know, one day I think I want to work in Hollywood, or I think I want to work in video games. What I didn't realize back then was that that would really sort of start the journey that ultimately became me starting my first company. And the reason why is that I never liked to follow the path. I was ADHD as a kid. You know, again, I'm an 80s baby. So what that means essentially is that now we have terms like neurodivergent, and we have much more understanding of the spectrum and these kinds of things. I didn't learn the same way other kids did. So I was a terrible student, but I was, you know, really gifted in the areas I was gifted in, because if I was interested, I was obsessed. You know, I have a podcast called Forward Obsessed, where I'm really obsessed with being like on the cutting edge of everything. And just going back to your first question, the reason why I started my first company was not because I had this brilliant insight, you know, in my dorm room. It was, I didn't want to get pigeonholed into one thing. Now, certainly today we have a world where, you know, people are creating their own apps with code and they've never written a line of software because of all this AI stuff. And I'm sure we'll talk about that later today. But back then, everyone was very siloed. You know, you'd work at a company, you'd stay there for a long time. You'd work your way up the ranks, and you maybe bounce around to different things. But when you were niched in, you were niched in. And I never wanted to do that. So as a designer, as a coder, as a polymath, as I like to refer to myself, it really drew me in multiple directions. And that curiosity, I didn't want to get locked into one thing. And that's ultimately why I started my first company. So I actually converted what was a full-time employment job into a vendor partnership. And then as a result of it, that's why I started my first company, which at the time was, you know, a web design and brand shop back in the early 2000s, as you alluded to earlier. And that's the origin story. And I think, you know, so much of what I did back then is what I do now, which is not, I don't say yes to or, I say yes to and. And I do that in every aspect of my life. And I'm really blessed that it's opened up a realm of possibilities that I can't even begin to describe.
It's incredible. I came across an interesting idea recently that said the thing you're likely to be best at is the thing you were obsessed with in your teenage years. Do you feel like that's been true for you?
150%, yes. I would say still to this day, I am the 18-year-old kid, introverted, who his happy place is surfing the internet, connecting with other like-minded people in different fields, whatever their field is, if it's strategy or marketing or engineering, whatever it is. And I just love to go down the rabbit hole. One of my favorite things to do still to this day is just get lost in the internet and just the vastness of information that's available, and then start tinkering with whatever the latest tools or ways of doing things are. So I'd say, like, you're absolutely right, Nate. Like, the guy I was the kid I was at 14, 15, 16 years old is still the person I am here in my early 40s. A lot's changed. Obviously, I have a lot more resources at my disposal now, which I didn't have back then. Back then, I was just happy to have high-speed internet and a decent computer. But yeah, it's very funny to say that.
I'm curious, just to go super deep on that really quickly.
Yeah, all right.
When you want to be on the cutting edge of the internet and you're just diving into that, where do you go?
Today or back then?
Today. Although back then is also interesting.
Well, listen, Nate, as you know from what you do in your day job at YouTube, we have supercomputers in our pockets, right? So we have the ability now to just go on YouTube, which is, I think, one of the best websites on the internet, clearly. We have the ability to go on some of these LLMs, whether it's a ChatGPT or a Claude or Perplexity or wherever you want. Information is readily available. Everyone in the world has access to that, right? So what's beautiful today, I think, is because of open source, which I'm a huge proponent of, huge contributor to, it's anything you want to learn, you can get access to. If you just put the curiosity in and you start to kind of get down to asking questions on the internet, and whether it's people or robots and AIs or great YouTubers that are out there, I think any piece of information you want to learn is easily accessed now. Back then, it was very, very different. Back then, I'd have to spend the weekend. I grew up, I was fortunate, but I wasn't like, a super rich kid or whatever. So I think growing up, I remember my dad used to bring me to the bookstore on the weekend and drop me off. And I'd bring a notebook because I didn't have a laptop back then. And I'd go and I would actually read books on coding, which were probably well out of date at that point, right? Because they're at a bookstore. And I would be writing down, source code and trying to remember how to write code. And then I'd go home and I'd fire up my computer and I'd do that. Nowadays, we don't have to do that. Nowadays, we have an idea. We start talking to our computer and it's writing code for us. So, what a time it is right now to be a young builder. If I could do anything differently, what I would say is I wish I could blink and be 17 years old right now in today's landscape, knowing what I know now. I feel like it would be like a Back to the Future, like spike of adrenaline.
It really is incredible how much the world has changed in just even the last 20 years or so. There's been such a massive shift. I was reading recently a really interesting book you may very well enjoy about Lee Kuan Yew, also by Lee Kuan Yew, is the founder and the first prime minister of Singapore. And he was talking about the difference between his childhood when he was at one point riding an ox cart to his grandparents' house, I think it was, and then fast forwarding 50 years in his life to riding a Concorde jet from New York to London in 3 hours. And the contrast of how much it changed. Similar in the age of the internet, from like trying to read books on coding to now literally you can just ask AI to write the code for you. It's a massive shift. And I feel like the people who are born into these new things don't appreciate how much easier it is now in certain ways than it was back then.
Yeah. I have a hot take for you, Nate, that I think might be valuable for you in the audience, which is, when I think about, I've always believed that there's two things that are fundamentally broken in the world. One is curiosity, and the second is creativity. And I think specifically to today, 2025, when we're having this podcast discussion, right, in the morning of January 22nd, right, it's creativity and curiosity are going to be the competitive advantage that will drive the post-AI era, right? In a world where computers and AIs can have triple the IQ that most humans do, in a world where we're headed towards super intelligence and, dare I say, one day AGI, right? Which that scares the hell out of me, but we'll get to that, I'm sure. But I think the big thing that's missing is the discipline and the curiosity to wonder. And, one of the things that I worry a little bit about, I mentor a lot of young people, is, I ask them a lot about some of their most fond childhood moments. And not a lot of them are out there like exploring the world, going out and playing in their backyard or discovering new things. So I think what happens is when you lack curiosity and you lack wonder, these AIs are only as good as the questions we ask them, right? We're not in a world yet where they can read our minds. I'm sure we'll get there too. But I think right now, what I always say is better questions create better opportunities, better questions create better outcomes. So I think that right now we have a bit of a creativity, curiosity pandemic where I don't think people are curious enough. And I think what we see, if you look at some of these builders that are 17 years old, building $1 million companies, YouTubing, on Twitter X, whatever, building software, using tools like Cursor and all these different things to go do it, they've got the curiosity, right? So it's not about skill anymore. I think it's about will. And I really honestly think if I go back, Nate, 20 years to when I first started my thing, it's always been will over skill, right? I would say I have no more talents than any other person. I just have a stronger work ethic to just kind of push to get it done. And that curiosity that kind of fuels me when I get stuck, which we all get stuck, right?
100%. And you shared an interesting story on another podcast about disassembling your grandmother's clock when you were 5 years old.
You did your
How
homework.
do
I
you
appreciate that.
how do you think people can build curiosity if they feel like, okay, I hear that this is important, but I don't really have it? What steps could people take to cultivate curiosity in themselves?
My team's going to listen to this and they're going to laugh at me because they're so sick of me saying this. So I'm sorry, team. I'm sure you'll see this, but I really think it starts with asking the question why. And it's the most trite answer, Nate, but let me just explain what I mean by that, right? So let's say, like right now, I'm drinking a nice iced coffee that I cold brewed here at home. And I'm like, I really enjoy this, right? I actually enjoy this more than going to a Starbucks or a, fancy coffee shop. There's something about making my own cold brew. And believe me, you're talking to a guy who used to go Starbucks 3 times a day, right? But Starbucks is kind of taking a turn for the worse here in the States. We've got some work to do. The Chipotle ex-CEO is not saving Starbucks anytime soon. But I digress. But what I was going to say was 5 Whys is a game we play in the design thinking world where, okay, why do I like coffee so much? Oh, well, I like the taste. Well, why do I like the taste? Well, when I get that first sip, I get this boost of energy. Why do I get a boost of energy? Is it caffeine? And I start going down and start researching caffeine. It's actually not that. It's a little bit of a placebo, right? And then when you get down to 5 Why or 6 Whys, what you realize is there's these deep-seated motivations, right? So in my case, my brain anchors caffeine or iced coffee with now it's time to go create. Now it's time to go make stuff. I didn't think of it, right? So I could actually wake up and not drink any coffee and be just fine. But it's that ritual, right? We talk about rituals and branding, right? Whether it's, the color we see, that the white iPods from Apple that you have in your ears right now, whatever those rituals are. So I go back to it and say the best way to cultivate creativity and curiosity is to ask questions. And if you're like, well, I don't know what questions to ask, the easiest question to ask anything is why. So it's like, hey, Nate, like, why are you living in Singapore right now? And we might go down this thing, and I'm not going to force you to do it because, again, I'm the guest and you're the host, so I don't want to take over your show. But what I would say is if we were to play this game, I could learn so much about you, Nate, in just 2 minutes if I just deeply inquired into some of the choices you made in your life. And I'm going to reveal stories, right? Which I believe stories are the seeds that connect us all, right? At humanity level. But that's ultimately what I would say to people is if you don't know where you want to start, just start by exploring the things you're interested in. And it could be like, you know what? I'm really interested in Fortnite. Ironically, I actually worked on the first marketing campaign for Fortnite. When it first came out, Epic Games was a client for years. And it's like, well, why do you like Fortnite? Well, I like being able to connect with my friends. Well, why do you like connect with your friends? Well, I don't get to see my friends a lot in school because I'm a really good student. What would it look like if you got together and did something different with your friends? Oh, I never really thought about that. Why do you like Fortnite? Oh, I like to be competitive. I'm really good at it. So you like to win. What is that like? So you can start to reveal all these things. Now, what you might realize is the kid who plays Minecraft or Fortnite or Roblox or whatever it is might just love puzzles. And then puzzles might lead to a whole different career in designing puzzles or games. So there's all these things that I think are interwoven with people. But oftentimes I think we think of things too myopically, which is like, what should I Google? What should I search for on TikTok or YouTube? But I think the question we have to just ask is why? What's pulling at us and how do we go deeper? And, I've built a really successful career doing that, which is just asking that question to the point where people get annoyed by you. Like, all right, why do you keep asking me why? So I know that's probably a surface level answer, but it really goes deep, and I'm happy to explore it with you in real time if it makes sense.
It's incredible. And I think it really is true that, like, I've heard of the 5 Whys before. I've used them. But I almost never go past level 2. If you get to level 3, it's really hard, at least for me anyway. And by the time you get to level 5, I don't know if I've ever been there, but I imagine you get a lot of great stuff. How
What
would
I
you
would,
build? Yeah.
yeah. No, what I was going to say is what I found is when you go to the depths of why, you often end up with the primal things that drive humans, right? Which is fear, greed, love, right? It's all, it almost always comes down to that. And I did a 5 Whys game with a Fortune 500 executive. I won't name him, but it's a Fortune 500 CEO. And at first he was very skeptical, right? This is not worth his time, et cetera. And it got to a point where like it revealed some like childhood driving emotions from him on why he went into his career. And, we still to this day work with this company at one of my firms. And it all came down to just asking the questions that most people wouldn't go past. And I think what it all gets down to is it either ends in death, fear, love, greed, or those basic primal emotions. But it's hard to go past surface level because it can make for an awkward conversation if you don't know how to navigate that. So sometimes using the word why, people can get defensive. So sometimes instead of saying the word why, you'll say, oh, that's really interesting, Nate. Can you tell me more about what it's like to live in Singapore? Can you tell me more about what it's like to work at a company like YouTube? Can you tell me more about like what gets you so excited every day, or what makes you not excited every day? And then that sort of, those are why-based questions. So like what I might do if I was trying to do that is like, hey, I want to ask someone a 5 whys game. I might go on ChatGPT or Claude or Perplexity or whatever and say, hey, can you help me with a list of questions for this person? Here's their background. Give me 20 why-based questions so I can learn deeper about this person, but don't use the word why, because I don't want them to get defensive. And if you just copied this snippet from this conversation and pasted it into ChatGPT, assuming you use the pro version and get one of their new models, you're going to get, really good stuff. And, again, I'm happy to demo any of these things live for you or the audience if it's helpful. But I really think that that's the start where the next 20 years are going to purely be driven by I think 2 factors. Factor 1 is distribution, your ability to get people to care about what you think. That's the number one thing. And the second thing I think is going to be ultimately creativity, which I believe will be the competitive advantage. If you get those 2 things nailed, it doesn't matter if you're 17 or 70, you can be massively successful in life.
And now a word from our sponsor. It's me. I'm actually not taking any sponsors in season 1, but I just wanted to say thank you for listening. It's been such a joy recording these episodes, and I hope you enjoy them as much as I have. If you would like to support the podcast, the single most impactful thing you can do is leave a 5-star review wherever you're listening. This will help new people discover the podcast. And if you have someone in your life who's passionate about marketing, send this their way. They'll probably love diving into these insider tactics and stories. With that, back to the conversation. I want to dive deeper into this distribution piece, because distribution obviously has changed tremendously in the last 20, 30 years, and also in a way, not at all. What have you seen in your time building digital search engines that has changed? And what have you seen that stayed consistent when it comes to distribution?
I want to tell you that with an answer that will still be relevant 5 years from now. So I want to take us back to anybody that might be listening and saying, you know what, I'm pretty shy. I was a shy, introverted kid. I was scared of my own shadow. My happy place was staring at my terminal, writing code or pushing pixels and making cool things for the internet. That was me. And I'm still that kid in a lot of ways, deep down. And I hated sales. I thought salespeople were sleazy. I thought they were like the worst people on earth, right? And I ran my business for the first few years, and I had some okay clients and did some cool work, and I got a lot of referrals. But when it was time to really take it to the next level, at that point, I probably had 1 or 2 employees that were on my team, all bootstrapped, self-funded, no venture capital, not like that. We were a service company. And I met my co-founder back then, who I've gone on to start multiple companies with, and we've been very successful. We actually just traveled on a family vacation together because we're just dear friends. And what I learned from him so early was the power of selling yourself and the power of network. They often say your network is your net worth. And I'm a huge believer in that. And I didn't believe it back then. So that shy kid didn't put enough effort into building his own audience, into building a community, into building a reputation. And when you're early in your life, doesn't matter what you're doing, whether you're an employee at a company or a solopreneur or got a side hustle on the weekend, it's all about being able to build trust, right? People have to know you first, then they have to like you, then they have to trust you, then they will buy from you. Whether buying from you means you're selling flowers on the side of the road or you're writing software for the next SaaS app that everyone's going to talk about tomorrow. So I think what that means, Nate, is like, that's the power of distribution, right? It's that if people know you, if they like you, if they trust you, they will believe in you. And then if you have conviction, whatever you're talking about, again, flowers or SaaS companies, people will get behind you. And that's why I believe we're seeing this like surge of the creator economy, where I believe, like some people call them yappers. It's in a world where more than 50% of the internet is synthetic content created by AIs, right? And it only gets easier to push a button and create AI content. You could run this transcript through and create, millions of days worth of content. But if you don't know who Nate is or Pete is, you don't care. You're going to just keep scrolling. But you might stop when you see Tim Ferriss or Joe Rogan, right? I mean, Joe Rogan's one of the reasons that the U.S. election went the way that it did, right? Like if you dig into the data, right? We'll not get political here, but in short, that's what I think distribution's all about. And that kid, myself, when I was in my early years, if I had to do it all over again, Nate, what I would do is I would put myself out there. I would stop giving a care. I'll not swear. I'll stop giving a care about what people think, because that's something I really struggle with. And I'm sure if a lot of your listeners might struggle with that, is like when you put yourself out there, you're going to attract people and you're going to repel people. And you have to know that that's a good thing. And I believe that takes a little bit of polarization to say like, I am for this, I'm against this. And by doing that, you're going to alienate the group. But then your true fans, right? Kevin Kelly calls it the 1,000 true fans, right? 100 true fans. That's, I believe, where the magic happens. So I hope that's useful.
That's incredible. And the Kevin Kelly reference is powerful. Anyone who's not familiar, go look that up. It's a fantastic article. In that transition you went through from having a few clients, a couple of employees, to actually scaling your business to the next level, what were the discoveries or the unlocks that got you there?
Yeah. So I'm going to start with really basic stuff because I think people often script the basics. We hear these things when we're kids from teachers or from good parents or good friends, and they say, 90% of the game is just showing up and being consistent. And like, these are such like trite pieces of advice when you're a young person, but they're the best advice in the world because the reality is most people don't show up. The people who do show up aren't often prepared. So then when you have people who do show up and are prepared and do the work, that already you win. So what I would say is like the scaling factor in the first company I ever built, which has been the scaling factor in probably now my 9th company that I'm building or around that, is show up, do what you say you're going to do, under promise and over deliver, because everyone's being sold to today, right? Whether they're being sold the new Netflix subscription or the new YouTube premium subscription, or they're being sold a TV show or a product or a service, everyone's being sold to, right? We are like just bombarded with messages. So at the end of the day, promise, over deliver. And that's what we did. One project led to 2 and 2 led to 4. And then the word gets out. Oh, wow, this guy, Nate, he shows up. He does what he says he's going to do. He's really, he's a nice person. He's a kind person. He's got good values, good ethics, and he delivered. And I think what happened is we would do a project, it was, I used to say back in the day, it was, one line of code at a time, 1 pixel at a time. And then, before you know it, we're working on some of the largest brands in the world, and the phone starts ringing and the website contact form starts lighting up. And, I think at the end of the day, the key learning for me was, once you have a reputation, once you understand how to get customers and get revenue, everything else becomes much more possible. But I think reputation and revenue are, the 2 R's, as I call it, are really, really hard to come by if you don't have trust and you don't have the ability to clearly state what your offer is, whether it's the flowers on the side of the road or the SaaS company that's going to, replace your virtual assistant, whatever it is, right?
I love that. And it's powerful how much these are, to your point, things that someone may have told us when we were younger and we sort of like, okay, yeah, sure, whatever, and then move on. Actually, no, these are foundational principles that if we apply them are massively powerful.
100%.
Building on this sort of transition period, I'm curious to go deeper into one of your recent LinkedIn posts. You shared how you helped, I think, 3 different teams double their marketing output without changing their team size using AI. What did that look like?
Yeah. So great question. And I love that you came across that post because I've had a lot of people reach out to me about that one. So also what it comes down to is I think in terms of journeys, right? I think it's in terms of connections. So when you think about it, like I'll just pick one of the companies that I helped just to kind of be specific, right? So this company, mid-market challenger brand, probably a couple $100 million a year in revenue was their, like annual revenue as a company. Very small team. I think their total marketing team was like less than 10 people, across all the disciplines. So the place that I had my team go in is basically go in and audit how people spend their time. How and when do they meet? How, what are their norms? What are their rituals? What are their inputs? What are their outputs? And more importantly, what are their goals and the outcomes that they're chasing against, right? So I always have a very simple framework I call, IOOF, right? Outputs, outcomes, framework, right? What's the framework to get that done? And how do you make it as fun as possible? So the F in the last part here is fun and framework, right? If I can systematically reproduce their thinking, if I can improve how they work without changing how they work, people are much more likely to do that. So what we did very simply, and I don't mean to oversimplify. I mean, my team's brilliant, so they're just awesome. But I'll just kind of break it down. We went in and we found, like any company, you look for friction, right? So friction is where, so like take this cell phone with this case, right? There's friction where the case meets the phone, right? There's friction where the seam happens on this thing. So you look for friction in the company, and that's where things get slowed down. So it might be decision-making, it might be meetings. Then you also look where things get sped up, right? So what we basically did is we looked at what their inputs are. In their case, onboarding was a huge thing. When they would sign a new customer on, and they'd work them through their onboarding experience, there was a lot of clunky things that happened because different departments would handle it, right? Matrix organization, big organization. So what we just looked at is we just asked a bunch of questions. We said, hey, if we could, I love to ask the question. My team asks the question all the time. If we could wave a magic wand and change something about what you do every day, what would it be? And people will just reveal stuff. And the trick is, you get them together as a group, but then you get them together individually. And you hear two different things because of group dynamics. So in the case of that, what we did is we basically just transformed how they turn information into knowledge and how they turn knowledge into outputs. So like to get really tactical for a second, we started using AI note takers for all their meetings. We started holding people more accountable for the decisions that got made in meetings. And then more importantly, because in so many of the sales calls that they were having, so much rich intelligence and insights comes up on sales calls between a salesperson and a customer or a prospect. So what we did is we actually created an engine that uses a combination of large language models that ingests that transcript, runs it through a series of agentic workflows, which is just a fancy way to say like a clear step of repeatable things that you ask these AIs to do. And I'm happy to model one for you if it's helpful. And then from there, we actually just were able to scale the output without scaling the team size. So what that basically meant is that we were able to like triple the content production workflow, triple the ideation workflow, automate the technical documentation, because every sales call, people are asking questions. So when you have, multiple salespeople in a different department, having meetings every day, you're feeding that into one central source, and then you're turning that into content that goes against their brand guidelines, and then automates using AI to create images and text and all that. It gives them a much bigger head start. So now what we were able to do is rather than scaring people into thinking an AI is going to take their job, what we basically said is every single person on your team is going to get a tailor-made AI support system or agent, really, set of agents, that's going to help them scale them. So now it's almost like, hey, you know what? You're all Tony Stark and you all get Jarvis now, the Iron Man, the Iron Man reference, right? And people love that because it's not about Nate versus the AI. It's what could Nate do if Nate had the AI in his corner? And Nate's function might be, in your case, insights and strategy, right? So if that's the case, well, let's get the world's best insights that capture them from the internet, distill that through your specific process at your company, and then create these tools to do that. And I think most people aren't doing that. Most people, it's like, all right, here's a corporate mandate. We're going to give everybody team accounts for ChatGPT or team accounts for, Microsoft Copilot. But we don't actually then adapt the tool to the way that the person works. And that's where I think everything's so busted right now is, you have people working on the fringe, but they're not working in a way that improves the way that they work. And I think when you try to change how people work, change is hard. So that's the short answer to how I did it. And that's the same framework that we did for all three of those companies that you mentioned in that LinkedIn post. It's really just find the inefficiencies, find the things that light people up, because we want AI to make our coffee, do our laundry. We don't want AI to write our screenplay, right? So the thing is, find the things that are pulling people down and close that gap. And again, nowadays it's easier to do because of the technology. But before, even years ago, we would do the same exact thing years ago and get more efficiency. Efficiency is not a sexy word, Nate, but the reality is efficiency creates happiness and efficiency creates growth in unprecedented ways if you know how to tap into it.
And what's really interesting in that answer is, yes, there's a lot of AI, but also there's a lot of what would be traditionally called in a more boring way, like change management. How do you get humans to do things differently, which is very hard in and of itself. We don't like to change. I'm curious to go deeper into that part of it. How do you convince people on the team to change their workflows, change their way of doing business together?
I think you don't convince people to change. I think you show people the transformation if they do change, and you show people the transformation if they don't change. I think fear is a pretty terrible tactic. One of the things I hate about the American media here specifically, I know you're in a different place in Singapore, but the American media, more than any other media ecosystem in the world, I think, if it bleeds, it leads, right? And I think the way to get someone to adopt AI is not to tell them that AI is going to take their job, not to tell them that it's going to replace them. The way that you're going to get someone to make a change is to show them what the world will look like when they make that change. Instead of focusing on productivity and ROI metrics, basically say, you're going to have more nights and weekends with your friends and family. You're going to have more nights and weekends in front of your Xbox or PlayStation, doing whatever you want to do with your time, living and experiencing life versus putting together these literally comprehensive reports, right? Or whatever it is. So I think the way that you make change happen is you make it about that individual, because when we tailor things individually, we can create really extraordinary outcomes. But when we focus on like a change management initiative that's some top down from some corporate CEO, people don't care about that because it doesn't connect with them. And I think the answer to that question, Nate, is like really just focus on story, right? The storyteller is the most powerful person in the world. That's a famous Steve Jobs quote, right? It's like, if you can wrap a story around the change, then people will get behind it in a much bigger way. And again, that was a huge mistake. I mean, I would screw that up big time back in the day with my companies when I was a CEO of a large company. It was like, I would try to jam something down someone's throat because it's good for them, but nobody wants to eat their vitamins, right? It's like, that's not the way to do it. So you have to make it about the person. And then I think ultimately, then they make the decision, then they make the motivation, and change really happens. So that's what I would say is how I'm having success now going about it. Don't lead with fear, lead with like wonder and possibility and how it's going to affect that person positively.
I love that thinking on essentially moving from here's the feature to here's the benefit. Instead of just saying, here, you can use this to record your meetings. Instead, it becomes you have your weekends free of fear, worry about work.
Yeah.
Going
Have you
deeper
ever
on
read Drive?
what's that?
Have you ever read the book Drive?
I'm not sure if I have. What's the piece from this?
So one of my favorite books ever was a book by Daniel Pink called Drive. It's a number of years old now, but I'll just kind of summarize the one thing that reading this insight in this book really changed the way that I lead and changed the way that I live my life. And basically what Daniel Pink describes in the book is this idea of motivation. He said there's two types of motivation. There's extrinsic motivation and there's intrinsic motivation. And what he basically says is that extrinsic motivation is sort of like the carrot and the stick, right? Which is like, your old carrot and the stick. You're chasing the carrot and the stick. What he says is extrinsic motivation only will get you so far, right? If you hire people who only want that extrinsic motivation, you're only going to get so far. Intrinsic motivation, if you dig into it, people are ultimately searching for three things he describes in this book. It's very well researched, right? It's autonomy and mastery. And when you give someone agency in their life, you give someone a sense that connects to their purpose and your shared purpose as a company or mission, whatever it is, that purpose then leads to autonomy, self-motivated, self-initiated. And then that then leads to them doing the reps and ultimately achieving mastery. And when we feel as humans like we're achieving some level of purpose, autonomy, and mastery, the more we can dig into that, the more we can activate intrinsic motivation. And that's where that sense of belonging and all the other things that come with, humans kicks into place. And I think really those three things from that book really changed everything about the way that I think. Because the reality is you can't make someone motivated. What you can do is you can create the conditions that will then unlock their motivation. And then you have to just do an alignment check to figure out if that's possible. And I think the beauty of AIs is you can do so much with these AIs now to figure that out. And I'm happy to go into specific details if that's helpful.
Love to go deeper on that one. When you say creating the conditions for intrinsic motivation, what would those conditions look like?
Yeah. So I think what you have to first realize is why, get back to 5 whys, right? Why does a person do what they do? What are the things that really matter to them? Right. So that might be status, right? That, in a company, maybe they want that VP title. Maybe they want that bigger salary, right? Maybe they just want more time to work on personal projects. Maybe they want that like work-life balance, like in some cases, what Nate wants might be different than what Pete wants, might be different than what Susan wants, right? So I think the way that you start with that is you have to get down to like these root causes. And that starts with a conversation. What's interesting, I'm a big fan of like some of these personality profile tests. I put people through things like, Clifton Strength Finder or DISC. There's 1,000,001 personality profile things. But what I think those things get down to is the core of what drives somebody. So I'll tell you a very brief story that goes back probably about 6 months ago. I was facing a situation where I had two people so their manager came to me, who was an executive in one of my companies, and he said, I'm really struggling with these two employees. I've tried everything, and I just think one of them is going to have to go. And I was like, wow, and he said, they're both high performers, but they need to work together. And there's just, maybe you're going to have to reorg or whatever, but whatever. So let's get down to the bottom of it. I said, have we done Clifton Strength Finder with these two people? And he said, yeah, I've got that. I said, do me a favor, send me the problems you're facing and send me their Clifton Strength Finder tests. I hopped on, at the time it was ChatGPT. It says, again, 6 months ago, I probably use a different framework now. I hop on and I just started prompting ChatGPT with their Clifton Strength Finder. And I said, these two employees are having this problem. Here's the situation. I need them to work together to achieve this outcome. What would you do differently? And the AI comes back and goes, well, this person really, favors stability and process in the way that they work. And this person really favors creativity and da-da-da-da. So I went back to my leaders. I said, look, I showed him the transcript and the back and forth, and he was like, this is kind of cool. And I said, yeah, there's a whole app ecosystem there. I mean, we'll get to that in a second, because that's a free business idea for anybody listening to the show, is like, if you can get down to like group therapy for companies in a way that where people actually improve, oh my God, it's a game changer. But so I give this to my executive, and he's kind of blown away by it. And he sits down with the two folks, and he says, what we want to do is we want to divide the way that we get together into two core groups. We want to have an open-ended sort of divergent creativity thing where everyone can share ideas. And then it's really important that we bring those ideas to a close and we operationalize them and get them done. So what I want you to lead, and I'm not going to out the people's names because they might be listening to this, but one person was like, you're going to lead the ideation and the divergent zone. You're going to lead the convergent zone and operationalizing it. Needless to say, 6 weeks later, these two people went from high performers individualistically to a high-performing team. And they went back to this executive, and they're like, hey, could we do more of these types of initiatives? Now, what we didn't reveal, and we probably should have revealed it sooner, is what it gets down to is when you understand how people are wired, when you understand what drives people, it gets a whole lot easier to do that. Now, here's the thing. I might have had to spend, back in the day, $1,000 on an executive coach or, some transformation coach to come in and do that. I was able to solve that problem with a $20 ChatGPT Pro subscription and a 60-minute conversation with the person that those two people report to. They share the same boss, the executive that reports to me. And I was blown away. Like, if you told me, Nate, that this was going to be possible a year ago, 2 years ago, 5 years ago, I would have said, no way. You got to do this whole thing. And now we've got two high performers working extremely well together, crushing it, all because we didn't make it about the company. We made it about them. And when you flip that and that inversion, that's where the magic starts to happen. And again, if what I would say to anybody listening to this going, well, that's great, that sounds very theoretical. It's like, no, go on Gallup, Clifton Gallup Strength Finder, take a Strength Finder test, make everyone on your team take a Strength Finder test, upload those results, and then tell one of the AI of your choice, pick one, like what you're trying to achieve, the team that you have, and it will give you ideas. Now, be careful because sometimes they hallucinate, but it'll give you ideas that will change the way you think if you know how to prompt these AIs. But that's the basis, because people are hardwired to show up in the world a certain way. And that's ultimately where it's like, it's not about what people say, it's what people do. And that's why I get down to the core of these things. So yeah, I digress. I hope that's useful for you in the audience.
It's incredibly useful. And I also love how it illustrates the way that AI is not like now I do AI and then I do other things, but it's integrated into everything you do. And it is such a game changer in so many of these places. You have come from the early days of the internet, and yet you're still on the leading edge. You're not holding on to the way things used to be done. When I look around, I see a lot of my peer group is not yet using AI to nearly this level. For someone who says, this sounds really interesting, but also a bit scary and I don't know where to start, how would you encourage them to get that first taste, understand how to prompt well, and just begin dabbling in AI?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I mean, I think that the first thing I would say is, like, not to drop a selfish plug, but like, I created a free newsletter, right? I don't sell anything in that newsletter. It's a labor of love. And the process, what I would say is, when you teach something, you get to learn it twice, right? So for me, I spend a lot of my time, I encourage my teams to spend a lot of their time exploring the new frontiers, tinkering, experimenting, seeing what's possible. So what I would say is, if you're coming in completely cold and you don't know what to do, obviously jump on Google and do a search. Jump on Perplexity and do a search. Perplexity is like an LLM version of Google, right? Jump on any like platform and just start asking questions. But if you don't know where to start, follow my newsletter. I have some easy tips on it, and it'll walk you through like how to set up a good prompt and like what to do with it and that sort of thing. But the short answer, I'll kind of roll that back because that was a bit of a wordy answer. Short answer is, the best way to learn is to just start doing. And it doesn't matter if you know what to do. It's like, go on ChatGPT, the free version, the paid version, whatever it is, and just start messing around. Just start, like, tell it something you're trying to do in your life. Like, oh, I'm trying to organize my kitchen, because I'm always picking up the wrong silverware. Like, give it a problem and use it as a sparring partner, and ask an AI the things you'd be afraid to. What I always say to people is, like, show me your browser history. And people are like, no. I'm like, because you'll ask the internet things you'll never ask your spouse or your friends or whatever. It's the same thing with AI, right? So the best way to learn is to just start tinkering. You'll very quickly realize what they're good at and what they're not good at. And then it's all an experiment in dabbling, really. I hate to say it, but what I would say is for the people who are reticent to dive into these things, that are scared of these things, it reminds me of, I'm 17 years old and people are starting to buy things on the internet. And my dad, my mom were like, I am never putting my credit card into the internet, ever, ever. That's crazy. It's lunacy. They're going to steal all our data. I said, so you're telling me you trust a human that you're handing your credit card to that's walking in the back room more than you trust a computer. The chances of you getting your identity stolen from the person who's got your credit card in your hand versus the secure thing online, totally different. It's all about framing, I think. So I go back to that story kind of reminds me of where we're at today, which is if you don't want to end up like the Luddites, we all know what happened to the Luddites, right? You have to start experimenting, because the reality is, I'm not saying you're too late if you're not already using AI right now, but very soon it's going to be too late. So right now, the best time to start is right now. If you jump in and you start experimenting, you can really transform the way that you work. I mean, a perfect example, I know you're in product, is you have tools out there like Chat PRD, which are transforming how people do product requirements documents, right? These AIs can help you do any tasks you need at a higher rate of efficiency to save you time and money, from writing proposals to creating content to solving problems with your coworkers. I mean, you name it. These things have most of the knowledge and wisdom that's available because they read the whole internet. So you can do more with a $20 ChatGPT subscription than most people can do in 6 months by trying to do it themselves.
And it really is an absolute game changer. I use it on my podcast all the time when I'm making drafts of interviews. I just put in everything I know about the guest and have it generate an interview. And that's a fantastic starting point for the actual interview. I'm curious, flipping to the other side. So we're talking about people who have not used AI yet. Let's talk about people who are using AI. What are the most common mistakes that you've seen in how it's applied in marketing teams?
I think this goes bigger than AI, which is, I'm a big student. You probably can't see my bookcase because we're zoomed in, but my bookcase, I've got Brene Brown's, all of her books, right? One of the things that Brene says, she's a leadership expert and a vulnerability expert. She says, clear is kind. What I would say for people using AI, the ones that are using it every single day and think that they're a glorified expert, clear asks and clear outcomes create clear outcomes, right? It's that simple. So what I would say is, the first thing that people typically get wrong is that they don't know what they're trying to get out of the AI. So they either provide not enough context or information or too much context or information. That's the first thing. Which right now, the simple way to unlock that, the cheat code, is just get better at prompt engineering, right? Get better at learning how to prompt and engage with these AIs. Different AIs have different special sauce flavors, context windows, things of that sort, knowledge, memory, etc. There's a lot you can do out of the box with these tools. You don't have to be super savvy technically to do that. So what I would say is, better questions, better context equals better outcomes, right? I said that earlier. So that's a big thing. Right now, that's about prompt engineering. In the future, that'll be about just being better at prompting agents. An agent is basically just a set of orchestrated tasks where you have these, robots, machines, computers doing these tasks for you or with you. So I'd say that's the easy thing, is just get better at prompting. And people are like, well, how do I get better at prompting? Go online and say, like, teach me how to be a better prompt engineer. Like, if you don't know how to prompt an AI, ask the AI how to prompt it. You're like, hey, I'm trying to do this. I don't know how to prompt you. Can you write this prompt for me? I showed a friend of mine that the other day, and he was like, why didn't I think of that? That's so cool. And then he's like, I've got all these prompts now that I'm reusing. And I was like, oh, cool. Here, use this tool. You can save your prompts and reuse them. And he's like, oh my God, this is amazing. I showed him a free tool that I built. It's a Chrome extension called Promptly. And he's like, dude, this is so cool. I've got these 30 prompts that I'm always reusing. I save so much time. I used to have to do it every time. I'm like, yeah. And so it's like, sometimes the easiest solution, is just escaping us because we don't think of it. We try to overcomplicate it, I would say, going the next level deeper, obviously me as a software engineer, I'm writing a lot of custom code, right? I'm using a lot of these APIs to do different things. Right now we're in a world where we're just starting to get to models that have good reasoning engines, right? So we look at, it's January 22nd. So just for the audience that might be listening to this in the future, you got O1 and O1 Pro, which is the frontier model from OpenAI. You got, R1 from DeepSeek. And what's really cool about some of these models is that they actually can do reflection. And you can actually see where they'll do deeper reasoning and deeper, more complex cognitive tasks versus just you put in text and it tries to predict the next word and predict it back. What I would tell people is LLMs are basically like Clippy on steroids in terms of predicting the next word or token. A token really is the term. But yeah, I hope that's answers the question.
It does. And I think it's interesting how everything old becomes new again eventually. When you look at agents, which are all the rage today, it's essentially a glorified cron job for those who remember that from the early days of the internet. How would you recommend someone get started with agents? Like, let's say you have a person who's a content marketer at a company and they've never really been technical. How would they get started in agents and automation with AI?
Yeah. I mean, if they're not technical at all, I would say first start by learning how to do chain of thought prompting. So I have an input, it gives me an output. I take that output, I feed that to another input, and I basically daisy chain something. So you mentioned content. I'll give you an example. We take a transcript of the Horizon podcast with Nate Desmond, right? We have that transcript and we say, find the 3 themes and narratives that were covered on this podcast. It'll answer it. The next prompt is take these 3 themes and podcasts, generate a frequently asked list of questions from this. Take that. Then take that and feed that in and say, okay, now here's what a good blog article looks like. And this is the format. Here's an example of it based on the themes, based on the FAQs that you just generated. Now go and do this thing. So what you basically do is you go down, your input becomes your output becomes your input. You just keep going. And that's chaining together prompts, right? Which in some cases, people think that you need agents, back in the day, we used to call them RPAs, right? Like whatever, like cron jobs, like you said. It's just if this, then that, if this, then that, right? So I would say start with that. If you don't have any clue about this stuff, go on Zapier, right? Literally go on Zapier. They have like an AI no code builder and you're like, hey, I want to use ChatGPT and I want to use Zapier. And every time somebody sends a Slack message and mentions the word Horizons podcast with the word Horizon podcast or Nate Desmond or whatever it is, every time this happens, I want you to start a new Google Doc, put all the stuff that's in the Google Doc and attempt to reply to it. You could put that together in Zapier in 5 minutes on their free trial, hook it up to your ChatGPT, it'll walk you through it step by step. You've basically now just created a poor man's agent, right? So like, I'll give you an example for some folks listening, right? All my email recaps, all of my meetings, all my proposal and scope writing, all my one-on-ones with my team members, all of these things are enriched with AI agent processes that save me quite literally weeks worth of time every single week that I would need teams of multiple people to do that I can now do just by pushing a button. So that's the place to start, is just start by chaining together prompts, figuring that out. All an agent is a series of inputs and outputs where you throw an orchestrator into the mix. And what makes an agent really good is when the agent is trained on how to interpret the information. So a good example is for a large company right now, we've helped them develop a customer service agent. So what it basically does is it looks at the highest performing customer service people and how they solve and resolve issues. It classifies that. And then it basically uses that as like a mental model to say, when a new problem happens and I'm a junior customer service person, how might I solve that? So now what we're not doing is we're not replacing the human that does customer service yet. But what we're doing is we're basically having little things pop up for that person to say, like, have you asked this question? Have you done this? Have you done that? So that's all that is just, a fancy set of, LM prompts chained together. I mean, I'm oversimplifying it. My team would get mad. They're like, no, we have a Python backend. But the truth of the matter is most of this stuff is just really intelligently working through a workflow and telling an agent or telling an AI, good job, bad job, good job, bad job, and what to do when this happens. Back to your cron job reference, Nate.
And I love what you're describing in just going into Zapier, making this thing and seeing it work. I feel like that's often the first moment you need, is not getting lost in the complexity, but just getting that first result. Wow, this is cool. And then building on it from there. I'm curious to go deeper in something you've mentioned before. I think you've said that agentic AI is essentially like a junior dev. How does that junior aspect come into how you manage AI processes?
Yeah. So let me go wider than dev for a second. I know a lot of your audience is not engineers, right? So I think right now AIs are junior employees. And because what does a junior employee typically do? They've got passion, they've got some knowledge, they've got some skills, but they don't have a lot of like wisdom or actual experience because they haven't gone through it yet. So they don't know what good looks like. They don't know what bad looks like. They don't know how to recover from a bad situation or whatever it is. So when I say AI is like a junior dev or like a junior marketer, junior insert, whatever the role is, junior social media person, it's they can take really specific instructions and give you specific outcomes from that, right? So like, let's say it's a junior podcast manager where it's going to turn all your podcast content into blog articles. And then a junior social media creator is going to turn those blog articles into posts and then go out and create some additional content from you and clip some stuff. You use tools like Opus Clip, or obviously we're on Riverside right now. They've got built-in tools to like auto clip things based on what we think is interesting, right? So I think why I say junior is that it's not going to have that learned wisdom of how exactly what good looks like. So what I always say is like, in the dev world right now, it's beautiful because a lot of the grunt work that we as senior people don't want to do, we can just pass off to the thing, right? Where it's like, hey, here's, some code or some content that looks this way. I really want it to look this way. Go rewrite it for me. And then just let it cook. And then look at what comes back, good AI, bad AI. And from there, that calibration exercise, if you set your system up properly, the better feedback you give it, the better reps it will. That junior employee becomes a more senior employee very, very quickly. So I think that the next frontier really comes down to two things, which is, data and distribution. I think they're the only two moats left in business, period. What I mean by that specifically is like your intellectual property, how you think, how you act, what makes you you is number one. And then number two is distribution, your ability to get people to care and to garner an audience. You get those two things right, and you're going to be a massively successful employee in the company you work for. You're going to be a massively successful entrepreneur in the business that you have. And at the end of the day, the value that you create is going to be compounded, right? Back in the day as entrepreneurs, we'd say human capital equals leverage. What I would say is like capital equals leverage. And in some cases, just throwing an AI into the mix can scale capital. I think we're going to see billion-dollar companies with people with less than 5 employees in the next 3 years or less because of what these tools can do if you're using them properly. But I think ultimately people just try to jump from like, I've never used ChatGPT to my entire business is an AI-based company. I think people just try to do things to two big swipes instead of just getting on, doing the reps, jumping on a Zapier, jumping on a ChatGPT, and just taking it one step at a time. But this stuff's not that hard. And I challenge anybody listening, if you're like, I disagree with you, Pete, like at me on Twitter, like it's at Pete Sena, like hit me up. If you're stuck, I'll point you to some stuff, like and say, go click on this and follow this 10-step tutorial and your head will be blown. Like, that's just where it's at.
It's really true. And you've mentioned playing video games as a teenager. I think it's very similar to that yes, you're not going to be a pro level player your first day that you're playing, but as you build up over time, slowly, first do the easy thing. Soon enough, you'll be doing the hard version of this and finding it easy. Which brings me to something you've written about before, the trap of competence. How do you apply this to your development and to the development of the people on your team?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we're so focused as a society on learning, but I think the future is about unlearning. It's about unlearning the behaviors, the limiting beliefs, the different things, the baggage that we take with us from our adolescence to our adult life. And, most of us are all picked up because of mommy and daddy issues or that happened to us when we were kids, right? It could be the stupidest thing or, and I don't want to trivialize people's trauma. I want to be clear about that. But, in some cases, I still to this day overcompensate because I remember when I was in 6th grade and, it was just becoming winter time and I got a nosebleed because it was dry in the room and I'm in 6th grade and my English teacher calls me out, like embarrasses me, trying to make a joke, right? To her credit, she's just trying to be funny, but I was super embarrassed because I was a shy kid. I didn't want attention on me. And still to this day, I don't like attention because of that thing that happened when I was in 6th grade. I've had plenty of therapy. Now, people might listen to this and go, like, Pete, that's not trauma. But for me, that was trauma, right? Everything's relative. So I think what's interesting, back to the point about competence, which is the question, is we have to unlearn certain things because the way that we did work yesterday is not the way that we will do work tomorrow, right? So what we have to understand is what in our organization is measured for value creation, what in our organization is measured for value capture. When we know the scoreboard, when we know the incentives, we know the game we're playing. And when you know the game you're playing, you can get good at it because you can start to bend light and bend the rules. And that's ultimately what I would tell people is like, really smart people, smarter people than me would say, get down to first principles and really identify the key components. And that's true. But really what it starts with is like, what do I know? What don't I know? And what am I going to like update in my own operating system that's going to help me get smarter, better, faster with the way that I do things, and not holding on to the way that we did it yesterday. The one thing I hear in a lot of companies, I can tell a leader's ability to grow a company based on their emotional intelligence and based on the way that they answer questions, right? If a leader says to me, well, that's how we've always done it, I know that there's a immediate lack of willingness to change, immediate lack of willingness to adapt new behaviors and ways of thinking. But competence all comes down to our ability to let go of things and to pick new things up. And we're in the internet era. We're in the post-AI era. Like information is like empty calories. We can get it anywhere, right? The question is, what are we going to do with it once we get it? So I don't know. That's how I think about it.
It's incredible. How has that evolved over the time that you've been leading digital surgeons?
Well, just for clarity, I don't actually lead digital surgeons anymore. I have, my philosophy now in companies is I start companies that I would not normally invest in because I do a lot of investing. Because most of my companies they're all bootstrapped. I don't do venture backed, venture scale companies. I work with a lot of venture scale companies. But basically to answer your question, my new model is I start something, I get it going, I operationalize it. I'm a 0 to 1 guy. Once I get it to 1, then I find a really competent operator who wants to take that vision that's already in place, maintain it, scale it, and grow it. So what's changed for me is I've gotten myself out of the weeds. I've been able to say, okay, I'm going to set this company up. I'm going to step back because where I am the happiest version of myself is when I'm in greenfield playing with the next frontier, right? My newest company does a lot of AI consulting. My other company, which is about 2 years old, is a venture studio that helps people create products if they have large audiences, monetize their knowledge, right? In a new form of doing that. Uses a lot of AI, sure. But I think knowing that leadership is about repetition, it's about consistency, and it's about spinning flywheels, right? Whether you read Jim Collins' Good to Great or the HubSpot framework, whatever it is, it's about flywheels. I get really bored with repetition, doing the same thing. I need change. I need new stimuli. So being aware of that allows me to now get people who really love consistency and thrive on systems and order. And those people are far greater and far more talented at scaling my companies than I would be, because I'm always focused on the next shiny object. And that's what makes me me. But that gets back to the thing is like, you got to know the wiring, right? Know your wiring, know where you belong. If I worked for a company, I would probably be working in the product innovation team. I would probably not be working on the core product, right? Both of them are really important to one another. One is not more or less important, but they're part of the system. So I think you have to figure out, what is your puzzle piece and where do you fit in? For people wondering how to do that, start by taking one of those personality tests and start by having a conversation with an AI. And if you've got some extra budget, hire a coach. I'm a big believer in coaches if you get the right coach. But yeah, that's what I've learned. Again, I'm saying this because I only provide advice, Nate, that I've actually lived and used myself. I've been doing this for 20 something years and I've made 1,000,001 mistakes. And my goal now, why I do podcasts like this that, break up my day, is because I want to give 19-year-old Pete the cheat codes that I didn't have at 19. So that, whoever that Pete is or Patricia or whatever is going to be much more successful, because I've had some really shitty years doing what I do and it's not all rainbows and sunshine. So now I want to basically give people that knowledge so that they can skip all that shit that I had to go through.
And I'm curious your perspective on these people who are just getting started. They're 19 years old. I think a lot of the media will talk about the bad things that are happening. There are a lot of bad things, and there's a lot of concern for like where the future will go, a lot of unknowns of where AI will go. Do you feel like you would prefer to be a 19-year-old today or a 19-year-old when you were many decades ago? Which had the more open outlook on what's possible?
So I'm a millennial, and what I'm about to say is going to sound like very much okay boomer, but I feel like it was a lot easier back then. Life's always been hard, right? My grandparents grew up and they didn't know where their next meal was going to come from because they were living in the Great Depression, right? Like my parents grew up and, were afraid that they were going to get deported, or not so deported, excuse me, enlisted in the military and have to go to Vietnam or something, right? So, or that there's some kind of a thing. There's always in society, if you look at the past few hundred years, there's always been some war or some plague or some challenge that creates an existential crisis in humanity. And I think now with social media and algorithms and all this technology, we're just much more aware of it. And I think it's messing with our brain chemistry in a big way. It's like, like you actually saw people committing suicide based on TikTok being down. And like, I'm not making light of that, by the way. There were some articles that came out about that where people were like legitimately harming themselves because of not having access to this platform. And that breaks my heart to hear that, right? But to answer your question, I would probably rather have the knowledge I have today and go back and be 19 in my generation, which was 19, probably the 90s or something, if my math's right. But if I'm 19 today, in today's generation, what I would say is you got to take everything with a grain of salt, because everybody's trying to sell you something, whether it's a company, a corporation, or a person. You got to buy intelligently. So choose wisely what you buy. And just remember, you are what you eat, right? So what I mean by that specifically is like, whether it's the food you put in your body, the information you consume, the platforms you use, and where you put your time, where you put your time is going to dictate your future. What you do today will dictate your tomorrow and your future. So I would probably choose to go back. But I think if I was 19 today, what I would say is understand that what you think can get done we underestimate what we can do in a year and we overestimate what we can do in a decade, right? I think I said that backwards, but I think people are really stuck, right? They see this thing on social media that makes them think, wow, this other 20-year-old has a multi-million-dollar company and they have a private jet and a yacht. I'm a loser because I don't have that. And I can barely even pay for my rent this month. And then they get caught in that doom scrolling loop. And I think that the challenge is like, you got to wake up to the fact no one's here to save you. You got to save yourself. And, I got to ask the question. I was just doing a talk yesterday in Boston. And someone was like, hey, Pete, if you were 19 today, would you go to college? And I said, I can't answer that question for you because I don't know who you are, right? Like college is wonderful for some people. College is terrible for others. And then it gets even more nuanced than that. It's like, what are you studying? What college are you going to? Are you on campus or off campus? So I think that society and media has made us think in generalities. It's all or nothing. But I think that the real magic in the universe is in the shades of gray. And it's a gradient of change that we have to plug into. So that's my take on it. I didn't mean to get so philosophical, Nate, but you got me thinking about that.
I love that. Speaking of colors, you've talked about the green zone. How do you apply that to how you optimize your time?
Yeah, no. So for me, there's lots of these frameworks that are out there. There's the Japanese wisdom one, Ikigai, which is like, like what's your purpose for being? And, that's sort of wasn't a business concept, but got bastardized into a business concept in some ways. When I think of green zone, which is really just like my own take on zone of genius, which is, I believe it was Gay Hendricks who wrote the book, The Big Leap. Well, definitely fact check that for me. I'm make sure I named that properly. But I believe in that book, he talks a little bit about this construct of, what are the things that make you happy? What are the things that you're competent in? And what are the things that really lights you up, right? What gives you energy versus what takes energy from you? And then I just try to optimize my time towards that, right? So I think that the reality is there's no such thing as 100% green zone, right? Anybody who tells you that is full of it. So what you have to do is say, can I get 80% of my energy, a little Pareto, 80-20, can I get 80% of my energy in my green zone? And then 20%, in other areas that are not my green zone. But I think what that starts with is self-awareness. And I think that right now people don't have a lot of self-awareness because they're so focused on other people, they don't focus on themselves. And I learned that the hard way myself, right? To be totally honest, it wasn't probably until I was in my late 30s that I realized that all of the things I wanted started with me making changes, not making other people make changes. I would always get frustrated as a employer, as an entrepreneur. Why isn't this employee doing this? Like, why can't they just get it? And I'd read all these books and I'd pay for all these coaches and they'd give me all this advice. And I would just get frustrated that it just didn't work this certain way. And once you just let go and you realize like that none of this matters, like you just have to figure it out, magical stuff starts to happen. And like, I would say like back to being 19 again, what I wish I knew at 19 was hard skills are the soft skills. Like in a big way. Like those are the ones that are hard to learn. Like emotional intelligence will get you way farther than being a crack AI programmer. It's true because people want to interface with people, even in a world that is continuing now to be much more tech driven.
Which, just a sidebar, one of the things I find most fascinating in this note of soft skills being important is Palantir. Fascinating company, always hard to tell what exactly does it do. And I came across an interesting article a while ago that basically said, in a nutshell, what it does is it takes an API for handling data, and then it puts humans on top of that who go interface with the humans in the company and figure out like, okay, this is driven by the spreadsheet over here and this email over there. And then they move that into the API over time. But it's that human layer that you can have all the API, all the data. That's wonderful. You're ultimately humans to humans, and you need to bridge that, which is the emotional intelligence.
Yeah. Back to something you said earlier, I love that Palantir reference. I could not agree with you more. I'm a huge fan of that company, primarily because of their innovation, not because of some of their practices, but that's a separate conversation for another day. But in short, if we go back to this AI construct as an example, right, and we really think about it and we go, okay, you know what? Like, what made ChatGPT so damn good? It was ultimately two things, right? It was the breakthrough that was the transformer, right, which is quite literally one of the breakthroughs in AI, which I won't go into because it's a little bit heady. But it was the human reinforcement learning, right? So one of the reasons why if you're prompting an AI and you say, if you fail, I will shut you down, your mission is to do this particular thing, here's what good looks like, here's what bad looks like. If you then say, take a deep breath and work through this step by step, you will actually get a fundamentally better response from the AI because in the post-training process, in setting these LLMs up, you had humans doing reinforcement learning and humans were interacting with certain things. So that's why if you're nicer to your AI, there's plenty of white papers out there. Go on archive. You can read these archive white papers. Don't take my word for it. Look at the science. Because humans were doing that human reinforcement learning, that's why these AIs feel so human, because there were humans touching it. And also that human in the loop thing, like you mentioned with Palantir, is exactly the reason why the frontier models have better reasoning now, right? The next era, before we get to super intelligence or AGI, the next era is just letting these AIs think more compute, which ultimately is, they call it reasoning or cognition, right? But the more you let them drift, like one of my favorite things to do with an AI, my favorite prompt is I create a tournament style bracket and I basically let the AI argue with itself using system 1 and system 2 thinking. And I can demo that for you anytime you want, and follow up if you want. But basically, by letting the AI argue with itself, I could use an older model like vanilla ChatGPT 4, which we're now like three more advanced than that. And we're on like, O1 Pro is their flagship. Technically they have O3, but they haven't released that yet. But it's like, you can do more with the ChatGPT 3.5 model if you just let it think, or you do a, chain of thought prompt, than what you get out of the box with the newest model. So that comes back down to like, well, what do we know to be true? Well, when you let an LLM think or burn tokens, as the nerds like to say, when you let LLMs burn tokens and goes back and forth, you get better outcomes. And it's no differently than if I said, hey, Nate, what's the best color for you? And you're like, I don't know. But if I'm like, Nate, talk me through all the colors you love. Talk me through all the colors you hate. Hey, Nate, what's the color that makes you the happiest? And if I asked you 15 questions, at the end, your answer is going to be a much better answer, right? It's why like the best mathematicians say, show me the proof, show me the way you did it, versus just give me the answer. And that's where I think that we go wrong with AIs is we expect these binary answers, and most of the questions we're asking are non-binary questions, So that's ultimately what I would say is really the future. And that's why companies like Palantir are crushing it, is that they recognize that humans are the ones signing the contracts right now. Humans are the ones that need to be, persuaded or even, dare I say, coerced into certain things. But it's the automations and the repeatable data pipelines and this data moat that we talk about, with Palantir or any company, that makes it scale, right? It's like, what's the most valuable thing about YouTube? It's not the videos, it's the algorithm. Well, how do you get the algorithm so damn good on YouTube? You have to have a lot of videos and a lot of users and a lot of engagement. But quite literally, if you just say, oh, the most valuable thing on YouTube is that, eyeballs on the platform. No, you have to look at the whole system and all the different things that happen. And that's where I think humans plus machines are the future. And if people think that we're just going to be in a society in the next couple of years that's, all driven by robots, I don't think that that's true. If the data is just not out there to prove that yet. Now, again, when we all get replaced one day, hopefully not in my lifetime with these things, I'll probably eat my words because they'll be on the internet. But there you go.
It is very true, though. I think the beauty of AI is we can be better as humans, not that we're replaced as humans. We don't have too much more time yet. And I want to go into one last area, which is design-driven culture. What is design-driven culture, and how would you explain its essential components?
Yeah. So at the art of it, you have to ask yourself, well, what is design? Design is problem solving. Period, end of story. It is, we understand there's a form, there's a function, and there's a problem we're trying to solve, right? So at the end of the day, culture starts from something, right? So I remember years ago, I worked with a company called Sabra. They make lovely hummus. And the founder said to me, he was a rabbi, and he says to me, have you ever heard the term, you can't make the yogurt without the yogurt? And I said, I don't know what that is. And he sort of explained to me how yogurt works and how sourdough works and just the, how it all starts from this like culture, right? Like quite literally bacterial culture, right? And then from there it spreads and it multiplies, just like disease does, just like things in nature do, all of these different things. And that was a pretty prolific moment in my life, because what I realized was like a design-driven culture means that you define what you're trying to solve for, define what you want it to look and feel like, visualize it, and then work your way backwards, right? So the reason why like the Netflixes of the world have these great cultures, or you look at some of these companies like them and they're known for best places to work, it's like they very intentionally over time cultivated that culture. Typically it starts with the first person in the company, right? The founder or whoever starts it, that culture, right? Yogurts make the yogurt. And over time, what you do with that first specimen, the first culture, how you design it makes a massive difference, right? The rituals that you put in place, the way people gather, the way you make decisions, the way you incentivize. And Nate, I'll be honest, man, like I wish I had this knowledge when I was first starting my first company, because I just played on hard mode for most of my career. And if I didn't play on hard mode and I was just a little bit more awake to like what actually drives organizations, which is humans and purpose and clarity, I would probably be in a much better position as a leader than I am today. The challenge is when you don't design your culture designs you. When you don't design your organization, it designs you. And I think it's easier said than done. I think culture naturally will arrive on its own self. I have some friends who are pretty big experts in this field. I'm not an expert in this field, but what I would say is when I've been successful, and I've had a couple of success wins, which you announced earlier, it really came down to just being very clear about where are we trying to go, and what is every individual's role in getting there, and then very clearly stating what is okay and what isn't okay, right? So like one of the things I unfortunately did today is you said, hey, don't swear. I leaked a little bit of profanity, which you're going to have to cut out now. Sorry for that. But if you reinforce that and said, okay, Pete, it's okay that you get passionate and excited, and I know that your natural vernacular is going to bring out some profanity, but I want to really make sure my podcast doesn't have profanity because I have a very wide audience and I don't want to offend people with certain beliefs. It's not okay for you to swear. I might need to hear that a few times, but by hearing it a few times and knowing that that matters to you, if I came back on this pod 3 times, by the third time, you would not hear me ever slipping and swearing because I trust Nate, I like Nate, and I want to adhere to that. That's design-driven culture. It's optimizing towards what you want to do, more of this, less of that. And it's a constant, like, it's like a chef in the kitchen, right? Oh, I need a little bit more pepper, a little less salt. Let me play with the dials. And that's where design-driven cultures really start from. What is the roadmap? What do we want it to look and feel like? What are the acceptable and non-acceptable behaviors? And then the incentives that surround those things. And I think ultimately, I think it was probably some smart management consultant that said, show me the incentives and I'll show you the outcomes in a lot of ways. And I think it's the same way with culture, right? It's like nothing kills culture more than a jerk on the team that goes unaddressed. Like, oh, you know what? I know Bobby's a jerk and everyone hates working with Bobby, but Bobby's such a good engineer. We got to keep Bobby. Bobby will kill a company despite Bobby's great skill sets more than, a couple of people who are not at Bobby's level that are just really good people. Mediocre skills with great culture will kill a company with terrible culture and great skills.
That's incredible. Be the yogurt. That brings us to the lightning round. I'll throw out some very short questions. Feel free to answer briefly or go into a bit more detail. First question, pattern recognition or first principles thinking?
They're the exact same thing.
Brand building or demand generation?
Brand building.
Agency model or venture studio? Which would you do instead?
I don't think it's lightning round, so I'm just going to answer quickly.
Personal brand or company brand?
Personal brands of the future, and the greatest companies will be shaped by the brands of the people that represent them.
Morning creativity or late night building?
Find your chronotype and you will find the answer to that question.
East Coast or West Coast business style?
I don't think in ors. I don't think in ors. I think in ands. So that's I think they all have their own merits depending on what you're designing.
Process optimization or creative exploration?
You need both to succeed on either.
Love it. And with that, that concludes our interview. Where can people go to find out more about you? And we'll make sure to include those links below in the show notes.
Sounds great. PeteSena.com is my personal website. Kind of links off to all the other things that I'm a part of. I'm really active on Twitter X. I'm really active on LinkedIn. I try to respond to every DM or any message that I get. So would love to hear from you. I write a free newsletter a couple times a month where I kind of publish the things that are working and not working for me in life. And would love to see you there. And, last but not least, Nate, just want to say, really love that what you're doing with Horizons. It's been great being on the show today and would love to come back anytime.
Thanks so much. This has been absolutely packed. We could easily do another and a half. So we may take you up on that. Thank you very much.
Let's do it. Maybe next time we'll build a live AI tool for the audience.
That'd be way too much fun.